All right, here in chapter 20, we're still on the cardiovascular system, but moving from the blood to talking more about the heart. So first of all, the functions of the heart. The right side of our heart is going to pump blood to the pulmonary circulation that's going to our lungs, and then returns the blood to the left side of the heart. Then the left side of the heart is going to pump blood to the systemic circulation, which is every other part of the body, so the remaining tissues, and returns it to the right side of the body. So these functions include generating blood pressure by way of heart contractions, routing the blood, so separating the pulmonary and systemic circulations, ensuring a one-way blood flow using valves, and then also regulating blood supply by changing the heart rate and the force of contraction depending on what our metabolic needs are. So if we just look at the overall breakdown, again, we have the pulmonary and the systemic circulation. So pulmonary circulation is going to go to the lungs. Systemic circulation is going to all the other tissues in the body. And the main difference, of course, there is that blood is going to go to the lungs to drop off carbon dioxide and pick up oxygen. And so the blood is typically shown as blue, meaning it has a lot of carbon dioxide, does not have a lot of oxygen, and then the red meaning that it has more oxygen, less carbon dioxide. If you remember back to the hemoglobin, we talked about oxyhemoglobin is bright red because of the oxygen on the heme, whereas whenever it loses that, it becomes a darker red, which is more indicative of kind of that blue color, or the darker color of the hemoglobin when oxygen is released. So a little bit about the heart. So it's about the size of a closed fist. It has an apex or a point, kind of a blunted end that goes into the rounded point there of a cone. The base of it is a flat part at the superior end. And it's located in the thoracic cavity in what's called the mediastinum. And this is the central core of the thoracic cavity, except kind of excluding the lungs. So it's important clinically to know where the heart is and kind of the shape, so that whenever you're listening to the heart sounds with the stethoscope or performing an ECG or performing CPR, you're in the right location. So again, just kind of looking at this, again, we all kind of know where our heart's at here, but looking at that thoracic cavity, the heart is there in the core. So the middle, just off a little bit to our left-hand side, is where that apex is pointing over to the left-hand part of the body. Now the anatomy of the heart, we have the pericardium or pericardial sac, which is made up of two different layers. We have the fibrous pericardium, which is a tough fibrous layer, and this is going to prevent over distension and kind of acts as an anchor. So it's the thicker, kind of harder part. And then the serous pericardium, this is a thin, transparent layer made up of simple squamous epithelial that is then divided into the parietal pericardium that lines that fibrous outer layer, and then the visceral pericardium, also called the epicardium, that covers the surface of the heart, which we think about epithelial, so epicardium, the surface there of the heart. And the two are continuous with each other and have this pericardial cavity between them made up or filled with pericardial fluid. This is just looking at that pericardium. So again, the pericardium is made up of the fibrous pericardium on the outside, that thicker layer, then the serous pericardium more inside, right from the fibrous into the serous part, we have the parietal pericardium, and then the innermost part there is the visceral or the epicardium, which is going to be that surface lining of the heart. And then in between those, we have that pericardial fluid. Now, if we look at the heart walls, there are three layers of the wall: that epicardium, we have the myocardium, and then the endocardium. The epicardium, again, as we just mentioned, that's that visceral pericardium made up of that serous membrane, which is a smooth outer surface there of the heart. The myocardium is the middle, so myo or middle, that's made up of the cardiac muscle cells, and that's responsible for the contraction of the heart. This is the thickest part, or the thickest layer wall of the heart. And the endocardium, think about inside, this is the inner surface that is a smooth surface of the chambers of that heart. We also have the pectinate muscles. These are the muscular ridges and the auricles in the right atrial wall. And then we have the trabecula carnea. These are muscular ridges and columns on inside walls of the ventricles. So that right atrial walls and the auricles have the pectinate muscles. Trabeculae carneae are on the inside walls of the ventricles. So if we look at the external anatomy, we have 2 atria, 2 ventricles, and then the auricles are just extensions of the atria. Now blood enters the heart through the superior and inferior vena cava, so the main veins coming into the heart, but it also receives blood from the pulmonary veins. Now the difference between these, most veins have deoxygenated blood. The pulmonary arteries, though, are the exception. Veins just mean they're bringing blood to the heart. So pulmonary veins are going from the lungs to the heart. But unlike most of our other veins, they're carrying oxygenated blood because they're part of that pulmonary system. Then the blood leaves the ventricles through the pulmonary trunk and then the aorta. And we have these surface grooves that are namely the coronary sulcus, anterior and posterior interventricular sulci. So we talked about these with like the brain, these indentations, but we have some grooves here in the heart as well that have names for those as well. And then just looking again here at the parts of the heart, and of course in the lab portion, you'll talk more or do some more identification and labeling of the heart. But we have the right atria here. The atrias are smaller chambers, and then the right ventricle, a little bit larger chamber. Then our left atria over here and the left ventricle. So again, the blood is coming into the right atria from that superior and inferior vena cava. And then we have our pulmonary trunk here that's coming out. And that is going to give rise and go to the pulmonary, to the lungs, and then out of the left, on the left-hand side, that left ventricle, blood is going to flow out into that aortic arch, into the aorta to go to the systemic side of the body. This is just looking at the same thing, just on an actual human heart rather than kind of the cartoon drawing here. But again, our superior vena cava coming in, we have our right auricle here, right atrium, then the right ventricle, then we have the left ventricle and the left auricle or atrium here with the aorta leaving to take that the blood to the systemic system. So there's also coronary circulation. So there's actually circulation within the heart. So if we look at these coronary arteries and veins, so the left coronary artery, this exits the aorta just above where the aorta leaves the heart. We have the anterior interventricular artery. That's in the anterior interventricular sulcus, and that's going to supply the anterior part of the heart. The left marginal artery supplies the lateral wall of the left ventricle. And then we have the circumflex artery that extends to the posterior aspect to provide blood to the posterior wall. And then on the right coronary artery, this exits the aorta just superior to where the aorta exits the heart. This is also in that coronary, is in the coronary sulcus instead of the interventricular sulcus. A little bit smaller than the left and extends to that posterior aspect of the heart. So we have the right marginal artery that's going to the lateral wall of the right ventricle, the posterior interventricular artery that lies in the posterior interventricular sulcus and goes to the posterior and inferior aspects of the heart. And we also have a lot of anastomoses, and those are connections, direct connections between arteries. This is just showing that coronary circulation. So again, arteries that are supplying blood to the heart. So that left coronary artery, right coronary artery are the main ones. But then we also have the circumflex and the marginal arteries, as well as the interventricular arteries, both anterior, posterior, right, and left. Now, what about the veins? Kind of the same thing. So we have the great cardiac vein that drains blood from the left side of the heart. The small cardiac vein drains from the right part of the heart. And we also have the coronary sinus, and these are veins that empty here and then right into the right atrium. And then there are several smaller veins that drain the rest of the heart. Now, if we look at the different parts or the chambers of the heart, again, we have the atria here or atrium. So we have the right atrium has 3 major openings to receive blood that's coming in. We have the superior vena cava and inferior, but also that coronary sinus receiving blood or from the heart itself. Then our left atrium, that has 4 openings to receive blood from those pulmonary veins. So 2 coming from both sides of both lungs. Then the interarterial septum, this is the wall between the atria that has a little depression in it called the fossa ovale. And this is a remnant of the fetal opening between the atria, which is called the foramen ovale. Then the ventricles and those associated features, we have the atrioventricular canals. These are openings between the atria and respective ventricles. We have the right ventricle that opens to the pulmonary trunk. That's going to take blood to the lungs to get oxygenated. The left ventricle opens to the aorta, and then the interventricular septum, which is the wall between those ventricles. Again, our picture here. So again, our right atria, right ventricle, they're receiving deoxygenated blood. That's going to leave that right ventricle and go out into the pulmonary trunk to take blood to the lungs. That blood is going to come back in to the left atria through those 4 openings. Again, 2 pulmonary veins on the right and 2 on the left. Those 4 openings bring blood from the lungs back to the heart. Goes from the right atria to the right ventricle, and then out into the aorta. We also have this interventricular septum, that's the wall between the 2 ventricles that's there. Now, the one-way flow is mainly in part to the heart valves of the heart. So some of those, or looking at those valves, we have the atrioventricular valves, the AV valves, and these are going to separate the atria from the ventricle. So on the right side, it has 3 cusps, so it's called the tricuspid valve. And on the left valve, we have 2, so it's called the bicuspid, but also called the mitral valve. Each of them, regardless of how many cusps, have those leaf-like cusps that are attached to cone shapes called papillary muscles using chordae tendineae, which are our heartstrings. That's typically what those are being referred to. Now, the semilunar valves, these are going to be the valves leaving the ventricles. So on the right semilunar valve, that's the one exiting to the pulmonary trunk. On the left semilunar valve, that's going into the atria or the aorta. It's called the atrial valve. Each of these cusps are also shaped kind of like a cup. However, there are no chordae tendineae that are attached to them. So we look at the internal part of the heart. So again, here's the right atrium. And again, these kind of strings coming down here when we talk about pulling on your heartstrings, that's the chordae tendineae that are coming off. And on the right side, again, we have the tricuspid. On the left-hand side, we have the bicuspid. They only have 2 of those cusps like structures. And then looking at the semilunar valve, we have the aortic semilunar valve that's leaving into the aorta. So again, we still have those cup-like structures. However, there are no chordae tendineae. And then you can see the bicuspid valve on this side. You can't really see the chordae tendineae from this view. But then we also have that pulmonary semilunar valve here as well, that's then exiting into that pulmonary trunk. A little bit more cartoon drawing here. So again, we have the aorta here. So we have that aortic semilunar valve. You can see that it's closed, no heartstrings here, helps you identify that. Whereas here on that bicuspid valve, we have those heartstrings, that chordae tendineae, and those papillary muscles that pull on those to open or close it. Okay, then whenever we have blood leaving, now that semilunar valve is going to open. Those papillary muscles are going to pull or to relax so that those heartstrings close, and it closes that bicuspid valve. Now, if we look at the route of blood through the heart, so what's going to happen here is we're going to start with the inferior and superior vena cava. They're going to bring blood into the right atria. We also have that opening coming from the coronary sinus. So blood coming into the heart comes to the right atria. It's going to go through that tricuspid valve, again, those chordae tendineae, into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it's going to go out through that pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, where it'll go to the right and left lung through those pulmonary arteries. Again, this is an exception. Most arteries contain oxygenated blood. Pulmonary arteries, though, have deoxygenated blood. They're going to go pick up oxygen from the lungs, and they're going to come back through those pulmonary veins from the right side and from the left side. So we have those 4 openings into the left atria from those pulmonary veins. Again, exception of the veins carrying oxygenated blood. They're going to enter the left atria, go through the bicuspid valve, again, those chordae tendineae, moves through that bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. And then from the left ventricle, so moving kind of underneath that pulmonary, pulmonary trunk, into that aortic semilunar valve, into the aortic arch, and then to the systemic system to carry that oxygenated blood. So just writing that out here so that it's in the PowerPoint for you, but again, just what I talked about in the last slide. Okay, and then just another visual here. Whatever helps you to remember it easier, but again, superior and inferior vena cavas to the right atria. Switch my colors here through that tricuspid valve to the right ventricle, pulmonary semilunar valve to the pulmonary trunk. Again, all this is deoxygenated blood, so it's shown here in blue. We go to the lung tissue and the pulmonary circulation to pick up those pulmonary veins, bring the oxygenated blood back to the left atria, through the bicuspid to the left ventricle, through the aortic semilunar valve to the aorta and coronary arteries, and then out to the body and that systemic circulation.